I think where Carmen really finds her voice is picturing and radically picturing the everyday, right? And I mentioned this is radical because she not only shows communities in joy, in rest, but she shows communities of color. This show opens May 2nd, so it's open to the public. Please come by, register at asuartmuseum.org. It's open from 6 to 8 that evening. As it closes September 10th. And I think importantly, what's so special about this show is that it's not just a retrospective that's spanning the 5 decades, but it's a contextual retrospective. Often when we see monographic shows, we're almost taught that these artists are working in silos, working by themselves, and it really isn't true, specifically for communities of color.
Looking for real stories of real people making a difference in the Grand Canyon State? Welcome to Finding Arizona podcast. We sit down with Arizona's inspiring entrepreneurs, creatives, and community leaders and give you a front row seat to their journeys, passions, and projects. Whether you're a local trying to find a hidden gem or just enjoy watching someone chase their dreams, Finding Arizona is your go-to place for authentic conversations with a desert twist. New episodes drop weekly, so hit subscribe and start exploring Arizona one story at a time. Welcome back, everybody, to the Finding Arizona podcast. I'm your host, Jose, and as always, we bring in fantastic guests every week. Today is absolutely no different. My guest is someone who has been quietly, but not so quietly, doing some of the most exciting curations happening in Arizona right now. I want to introduce Alana Hernandez is a senior curator over at ASU Art Museum in Tempe, where she leads the curation team and oversees the entire exhibition program. Her practice centers on amplifying Latinx art in all its complexities, the intersections and nuances, the stories that don't always get told in the way that they deserve to be told. Before landing in the Valley, she built an impressive resume that took her from the Whitney Museum of Art in New York, where she worked on landmark shows including Vida Americana, to the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, to serving as its executive director and curator at the CALA Alliance. She holds her MA at the CNYU Hunter College, where she specialized in modern and contemporary Latin American art. Right now, she is in the middle of a what might be her biggest project in her career. I might just say that as a person, a major retrospective called Carmen Lomas. Help me with the last part. I'm so
Carmen
bad.
Lomas Garza. Yeah.
Okay, Garza. I wanted to make sure I got that. This is the first retrospective of this pioneering Mexican American artist. It's been more than 2 decades this person has been working on on their stuff, and it's open now to the ASU Art Museum through September 10th. Admission is completely free, and she has edited a gorgeous scholarly catalog that accompanies the show. So it is my true honor to share with you this episode, and we are going to get right into it with Alana Hernandez. Thank you so much for joining the show today.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. I mean, just everyone already knows I went to school at ASU, so being a Sun Devil advocate is always just something I'm so proud to continue forward. So I will ask you the question that we typically ask everyone that comes in through our doors. Will you give us a little bit of your origin story? You've worked everywhere from like New York City to San Diego, and now you're curating for here at ASU. What was that moment you realized Arizona, and specifically this museum, was where you wanted to plant your flag?
It's a great question. Yeah, thank you again for inviting me. So originally I'm from California, and then I decided to go to New York. I was in New York for a long time working at all these various institutions, and I really came upon a couple of things. I was trained as a Latin Americanist, as you mentioned, but while I was in large institutions, specifically as I started working at the Whitney, I realized that we were being asked to do two fields, right? I was trained as a Latin Americanist,
Hmm.
really focusing on art from Mexico, right?
Yeah.
Specifically between 1920 and 1940 was my bread and butter, as it were. But we were kind of tasked to also start creating this burgeoning field of Latinx art, which is
Hmm.
artists from the Latin American diaspora really rooted here in the United States, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And I realized that this field is happening. So as I moved from New York to San Diego to move up in my career, certainly, and find my own voice, as it were, I thought it was important to be near a site that understood how complex these stories are, right?
Mhm.
We cannot tell a comprehensive story of the United States without including Latinx stories, right?
Yes.
And so importantly, I go to San Diego. The context of the border was very, very different, right? 30 miles away is Tijuana. People traverse the border back and forth. And so
Yes.
then when I moved to Phoenix to become an executive director of Kala Alliance, which I changed into a residency program to really support artists from the Latin American diaspora, I
Mhm.
realized that the context again was very different, right? And so I thought what was so important to be in Phoenix was to really understand that um, this place is such a hotbed of artists, right? But
Mhm.
also not of just
Yes.
artists, but of topics, right? In the next few years, Arizona is going to be the site where national conversations will start and decide many
Absolutely.
things, right?
Absolutely.
So it is a really important, beautiful, complex place to be doing the work.
Yeah.
And it also feels really urgent, right?
Mhm.
And so of course, I had so much of my career, so much of my network is in New York and San Diego and other places. But it felt like Arizona was such fertile ground, right?
Yeah.
And specifically in how we relate to our communities and how our communities
Mhm.
support art, not necessarily other foundations, right? That's something that we're hoping to build here in Arizona,
Yeah.
a larger infrastructure for arts and
Mhm.
culture, but certainly it's a really fertile ground.
I think that's it's incredible that you had the foresight to see that, especially at a younger age where, 20 something, I probably wouldn't have the same exact foresight. And it's something that I was even living here and enjoying the fruits of all of those evolutions. And one of the things that I find particularly enjoyable is when outside perspective and outsiders look at us as a melting pot and a kind of, like you said, fertile ground for new things. And I 100% agree with you. I have witnessed in my time just here going to school and kind of, growing in my own roots here. I have witnessed so much in diversity, in evolution of perspective, because, you look at just one category, food, in this space. We have now recognized nationally chefs that probably wouldn't have the same views probably 5 years earlier. And it is incredible to see such a new look at what we have to provide here. So I agree with you 100%. I would love to understand your own family dynamic. Can you give me a little insight on your parents and just kind of like, was there anyone in your life that was promoting arts in your household? Because I imagine there had to be at least one person. I look at just my own life growing up. I had just a cavalcade of people telling me how much art, can influence individuals and groups and communities. But I would love to understand your story.
Yeah, so I mentioned I'm from California, originally from the Inland Empire, but then, went to high school in Mission Viejo, California.
Okay.
My father was a chemical engineer, my mother a
Okay.
school teacher. Um, but art was important. We went to museums growing up, and we traveled a little bit internationally growing up, things like that. So
Mhm.
I did have kind of that entry point into museums, which is really special.
Yeah.
But I really credit coming into the field. I was a Division I athlete in college, right? That's
Oh,
what paid
nice.
for school. And I had
Congratulations
this
on that. Right.
thank you. I had a professor my junior year of college that was this art history course. It was Italian art, the high Renaissance, right?
Got it.
And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is like my aha moment, right? I
Beautiful.
didn't know what curating was. Certainly, I had never seen anyone like me in
Hmm.
museums. I didn't
Hmm.
know that was a possibility. And, I went to this pretty small liberal arts college in Brooklyn. And he really convinced me that, like, you can do anything you want to do. And my parents have always been really supportive
Yeah.
as well. But I didn't know it was a career. I certainly didn't
Yeah.
think that it was available to someone like me. I remember applying to grad school thinking I was going to study the Renaissance, right?
Yeah.
And then there is kind of this reality that sinks in. Wait, my last name is Hernandez. I am a brown woman.
Mm-hmm.
Who will take me seriously, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so this is the quick pivot to studying. I'm like, well, I think I like Latin American art, right? I remember growing up, I think like lots of Mexican American households, we had mini canvases or mini prints
Yes.
of the Diego Rivera. So I
Yes.
remember seeing calla lilies, right, growing up. And I'm like, okay, like I've seen this before. I can do this. And I really focused in on that. And that was,
Beautiful.
you know, it- I tell that story because it was an unfortunate part of my understanding of
Mm-hmm.
how I navigate the world. But I think it was also it was a blessing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I studied with Harper Montgomery and Linda Klitsch in grad school,
Mm-hmm.
who were some of my earliest and best mentors in learning about Latin America, and then by that extension, how that connects to Latinx art.
Yeah. I love that because again, my whole purpose for asking these types of questions is really to understand the tree as a whole, even the roots. And so my enjoyment is to dig through the dirt and find those roots. And I think it's very beautiful that for some people, life in their actual pursuit and it comes in at different times. That aha moment hits differently when you're 10, 15, and then going into 18, 20, 22. Those types of things always I find compelling because it's just to me for my own history, I only had people telling me to go into STEM or finish,
Mhm.
go to school, get something, work on something that will, give you money and allow. And I always had this other side, which is growing up culturally in a tribe that is completely dominated by artists and trying to keep itself relevant in a type of way through the art, economically, especially because a lot of these artists spend lifetimes of going and traveling to art museums and art project, events to sell their product. But I wanted to find a thing that kind of brought together those two elements, and landscape architecture when I went to school kind of filled those two gaps in a way. So I loved that, and for me because I was getting these two um, very different entities coming together in this one kind of what I felt were like it's a beautiful demonstration of both art and design and mathematics, all of it just really well played to my strengths. So that's kind of my history is just being told to do one thing, having an organism or an organization kind of telling me another, and then deciding to try and bring those two things together as best as I could. Now, I will go into about how this podcast came to life with you later on, but I will now kind of pivot to the curator as a creative director. I mean, what we're talking here is one part um, this job and our listeners who are entrepreneurs and brand builders. And when we hear how you describe the curation, co-creating building networks, amplifying unrepresented voices, it honestly sounds like a launching of a startup to those that are probably out there listening to us right now. How do you think about the curator's role? And does it feel more like a creative director or something else entirely?
It's a great question, and you can ask many different curators, and we'll all have different answers. I fundamentally believe as my job as a curator is as a translator, right? I see curatorial
Yes.
work as translation. So I help translate artist ideas to the widest possible network of
Mhm.
folks, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so often yes, I'm a contemporary art curator, but also was trained as a modernist. And so all of that also has to deal with our history, right?
Yeah.
As I work with artists from the Latin American diaspora, Latinx artists, we're quite literally right now creating a canon as we speak,
Mhm.
right? We're
Yes.
really understanding that this group of artists, this people that fall under this umbrella, have traditionally been left outside of art history. Art history is typically taught from a very specific vantage point, right? And so what
Mhm.
we are trying to do is upend those kind of exclusionary practices to create and insert things
Mhm.
into the canon, into art history, right?
Yes.
And so as excuse me, as a curator, when I work with artists, both exhibitions become a framing of art history, but it's also a relationship of sorts, right? And so I talk about this in my practice a lot. That my practice is quite relational, right? So when I work with artists, it's not kind of a one and done, but it's an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing
Yeah.
partnership as we work to create a specific project, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think really fondly of my past shows when I create kind of group shows. Each
Mhm.
of the artists that I'm working with, we have different relationships, right? Because there are different needs. But it is, at the end of the day, I see myself as both someone that corrals ideas together, right? To
Mhm.
keep them succinct, to keep them together, because artists think very differently than we do, right?
Yes.
So I try to disseminate those ideas to the largest possible audience. And so that's why I think a lot about translation in that regard. So less about, and some curators will say that they're artists themselves, right? Which is a fair point, but you know, I really think a lot about the work as translation.
I think that's so beautiful too, because I think that's one of the parts that, as a consumer of the product, I think translation is kind of key to this whole dynamic between the art goer and the artist and the curator. There is somewhat of an element that we all have our own perspectives and views. And when you go into an element that is you want the event to kind of be like it's an open dialogue between the artist and the individual, but I find it so fun as a kind of like even a podcaster. It's like you are the host of the podcast show and you come in and you can provide an outline of what's happening here. But the real fun is seeing how it translates between the artist and the art and the
Mhm.
art goer. And so one of the things that I find just so beautiful is like again, even the when you're curating elements to each individual's exhibit, the thing that kind of really I'm a reader. I like to read the little inscriptions and
The
every
didactics. Oh, that's
yeah.
great.
And so it matters because the words, it's like the same thing as, this is kind of the element of the landscape architect in me. It's like we place statues and wayfinding ways, parks, all of it. You just like you have those signs. Read the signs. There's all
Mhm.
sorts of signs. And it's fun because you'll get little tidbits of like stories and elements that you wouldn't if you just looked at the art for what it is. If you read the inscription or the insignia, there would be some level of like, because they choose the words for a reason. There is some level of like the importance for every singular word that is placed on those insignias. But I think that's something of for me of like I always find it so fascinating because one time I watched someone look at a piece of art for a very long time, did not read the thing, and just was like staring at it for a long time. Read the captions and was just moved, like started crying, and was so with such a it was such a moving moment where it's like, oh, that's the thing that I love about this kind of back and forth between the individual, the artist, and just having that moment, just witnessing that moment was really enlightening and beautiful. So I will now kind of ask you, as the curator, what makes a good pitch when an artist comes to you with an idea, or when you're pitching an exhibit or a concept to your team or to the founders, even? What makes you say, yes, this is it? And what is the thing that hooks you?
It's a great question. I think um, typically when I am thinking of exhibition, so I don't necessarily have artist proposals come to me, right?
It's perfectly fine.
Generally, that's just like how the institution works. And we do have a set of parameters to kind of work within, and that's just kind of logistical
Mhm.
part of creating exhibitions at the ASU Art Museum.
Yeah.
But I will say, in terms of when I'm kind of pitching an idea, I'm thinking through something,
Mhm.
and this is the co-creation of it all, right? So what I tell my team is that we should be telling each other spaghetti on the wall thoughts early,
Yes.
right? What we start working through thoughts, we start working through artist lists, things like that.
Mhm.
And it's not really what we're taught as curators, right? So the field is changing and how
Mhm.
institutions work are changing. So when I was coming up, it was almost sacred. You hide your ideas, you don't share them because there's like this large competition. And I just
Mm.
firmly don't believe that. It's not how I teach my curators to be curators, right?
Okay.
It's important to be in conversation, especially early on, right?
Mhm.
And so, for example, I've been working on this show with a dear colleague and friend of mine on delusion, right? For now, we've been working on it for about 6 years, right? But it's one of those shows that of course, I have a really strong network of colleagues that we talk about it, in both informal ways and formal ways. How can we create convenings, but also how can we send memes about it, right? Things like
Yeah.
that. So I also think what's really important about curatorial work is that indeed it's deep research, it's art history, but there is a levity to it, right? And
Yes.
so really talking with folks, the artists that, again, it's relational. So if I'm working with an artist on an artist project, likelihood is that they might be with me for the long haul, right? So they'll be in another show, they'll be in a big group show, whatever it is, but things like that.
Well, I think that's incredible that you're looking at this perspective in more of a long term. I think that's really great because I think that's how this works. I mean, this works better in a long term format. I think especially when you look at an artist's entirety of work and scope, and it's just something about the long term perspective and just how one evolves. It makes it more, I don't know, tangible in a sense for the artist viewer to relate on that level of like, this is a long time that they've been putting in this work, and how incredible to see A, B, and C. Um, I will now kind of more ask you about, because we're talking about relationships, and now I'm kind of looking towards what you're doing right now and your relationship with Carmen. Um, this retrospective of her is over 25 years in the making. She's 76 years old. Her work is beloved. Her children's books are in classrooms across the country. So why has it taken to today, maybe some might say taken this long, of why did you feel like it was ready right now and going about it now?
It's a great question, and I think it has a couple of things. It has a lot to do with the field, right? So,
Mhm.
um, I think there are people like me that are now further along in their career in places that they can pitch exhibitions
Yeah.
of things that are outside of what traditional art history is, right?
Hmm.
And that's just like kind of a logistical thing.
Yeah.
Art
Yeah.
history, as I mentioned, is really told from a specific vantage point. Institutions
Hmm.
have been slow going and understanding that there are multiple vantage points, multiple stories that make up this country, for example. And
Yes.
so I think, we see kind of our elders, our elder Chicanas, for example, Molly Missabines had her retrospective a few years ago, right?
Yeah.
And so, like I said, people are at a point where they're like, okay, well, now we're starting to look. Um, but often that's too late, right? So
Hmm.
there are so many of my colleagues that have, finally been able to do a
Hmm.
show and the artist is no longer with us, right? I remember starting at the ASU Art Museum and I had told Mickey, like, hey, I want to do an exhibition on Carmen Lomas Garza. Her last retrospective was in 2001, but she thinks of the 1992 retrospective really as her big, important retrospective.
Yeah.
I'm like, there's a whole generation of folks that are my age, right? I was born in 1982 that
Yeah.
haven't seen Carmen's work, right?
Yeah.
And I think importantly, what's so special about this show is that it's not just a retrospective that's spanning the 5 decades, but it's a contextual retrospective. Often when we see monographic shows,
Yeah.
we're almost taught that these artists are working in silos, working by themselves, and it
Hmm.
really isn't true. Specifically for communities of color in this kind of way, it's important to show the network, right? And this is what's really special. This is a contextual retrospective. So we're seeing
Hmm.
Carmen's career over the decades really
Yeah.
expand, shift, change, become more mature. But we're also seeing artists that were working alongside her who not
Mm.
only influenced her, but they were in conversation. Back to what I was saying about how curatorial work should be more collaborative.
Yeah.
Certainly, artists and artist spaces were really, really important in that regard. So Carmen really starts her career uh, kind of is galvanized to move forward because the Chicano movement is happening right around this
Yeah.
time, right? And so
Yeah.
we're seeing really early examples of her work, but alongside of those of her peers that are really building a Chicano movement in South Texas. It's something that we're also taught if we're taught about the Chicano movement, that there's really only one, and it really happens in the late 60s into the 70s, and it's really rooted in California.
Yeah.
Again, this isn't true. There are multiple movements happening
Yes.
across the nation. There's constellations, what I like to tell my team. When we think of art history, when we think of mapping, we should think of it in clusters and
Yeah.
constellations. Things are happening
Yes.
at the same
I love
time and they're
that.
not linear, right?
I love
And
that.
so that's what's really special about this show is that we're seeing a non particularly linear and it's also looking at multiple artists' career at the same
Yeah.
time.
I think that the allowing yourself to look at it in a constellation form will allow you to also understand that when you go to specifically, let's say, other museums that aren't particularly large, that have these curations of these smaller movements, I think it's imperative that we look at those moments and look directly at like the specific moment in time, because that is so much fun to me to see that element in that moment. Because when you look, like you were bringing up 1992 and some of us weren't alive back then, I would love to see and understand for her like why that particular one was so important to her. And I would love to understand too is like from that 1992 point in her life and the route that she took from that point on, and just kind of understand 2001 in particular, that is a time in itself where you have a change in um, language in our country, a perspective about security, and moving into a new kind of volatility about you know this is like the migration movement, like
Mm-hmm.
allowing in we were very more open to the back and forth kind of that lifestyle, and you can see it in just how much we've had restrictions from that point on in 2001. So I go back to like I love understanding pinpoints in time and kind of seeing evolution kind of grow from there. I will because this is something that I kind of read on your end, is you've described Carmen's work as radically joyful, showing intimate family moments, birthday parties, backyard party scenes. That feels really counterculture is in a fine art world that often rewards darkness and complexity. Why do you think joy has been more undervalued in serious art, and what does it mean to champion it for years for you?
Such a great question. When Carmen is trying to find her voice in the Chicano movement, we know art is used as a vehicle to to galvanize people together, things like that, right? Especially of artwork coming out of the Chicano movement. A lot of it has to do kind of with labor, um, you know, the grape strikes, things like that, right?
Yeah.
So Carmen was kind of struggling to find her voice. She didn't know what it looked like, because she does have, and you'll see in the retrospective, some early more intense images, right? But then I think where Carmen really finds her voice is picturing and radically picturing the everyday, right? And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mentioned this is radical because she not only shows communities in joy, in
Hmm.
rest, but she shows communities of color. There
Hmm.
are brown people of color
Yeah.
in rest, right? And I think this is really, really important, right? We don't have to always show the lucha, for example. We don't always have to show the fight, right?
Yeah.
And that's so important because showing us at rest, celebrating is a fight in its own,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
she's fighting for representation in that manner, right?
Yeah.
And what's
I
so,
yeah, that's
go
amazing.
ahead.
No, no, no. I was just gonna say that was amazing. You said that you hit it right on the head. So
I
continue.
think it's just super special, right? And so, and what's also really beautiful is that these stories are not, made up,
Mhm.
right? They're
Mhm.
they're memories of her grandparents
Absolutely.
working in the field. So there
Yeah.
is what's really beautiful, and you'll see throughout the show that it's split into 7 sections. Some smaller sections I'm calling vignettes, which are on healing, on generational traditions,
Oh,
on adolescence and
nice.
growing up. But then there are sections, and it's about labor, right? And it's not labor in the same way that we're seeing, like with UFW, but we're seeing land as a form of labor. And
Mhm.
how does foodways function as that labor? How does domestic sphere function as labor, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that's what's so special about Carmen's work. And because we're seeing it at such
Mhm.
scale, we're seeing that, it's a very distinct outlook and a very
Yeah.
distinct contribution from the Chicano movement forward, which is really beautiful.
I know that I am not an expert in this, but I do have a fascination and somewhat of a novice knowledge of the art history. One in particular that kind of stems from our conversation is what's popping out to me is during the Industrial Revolution. It felt like more artists were, especially in England, drawing life in those moments where you see steel mill workers, just more worker based drawings where it's like you see gatherings of groups in these large cityscape areas and these focus around these chalk arts, seeing miners come out and having black soot on their face and just more of that time of like relevance on the moment at hand and moment in time right there. I just found that particularly like in my head stemming from that conversation of like looking at those vignettes of life and how we just kind of live in it, and you have an artist who sees it in a different perspective and just wants to put it down on canvas or whatever their medium is. It's really quite fascinating to see it be seen outside of its timeline, and people taking it in and be like, oh yeah, they're connecting to that because they're either were a young child and know what it felt like to be in that vignette or in that moment, or they're trying to relate. They're trying to understand, okay, well, if I live outside this and it's happening right here in my neighborhood or happening right here in my city, how did I miss this? And I find that so incredibly moving. Um,
Mhm.
the other thing too, you brought up lucha. You guys, I was reading in my research. One of the ones that popped out was the Beso a Virginia 1983. It's a silver print, and it's the luchadors kissing an older lady.
Right.
And I'm a avid lucha pro wrestling fan, but also just in general like a history on lucha, and just I love when I get to see things like that. And that's something that just like when it was talking about you and you were in the article, I saw this piece and I was like, huh, that's just something that popped out to me. But that's neither here nor there. I'm going to move on to building a community of practice and just kind of talking to you for this retrospective. You've assembled what you call a community of that practice, a chef, educators, health professionals, alongside the visual art world's alongside the usual art world suspects. That's widely unconventional. That's widely an unconventional move. Walk us through that decision and what it unlocks for the exhibition.
Yeah, so every exhibition at the ASU Art Museum has a community of practice, which I think is really important. Again, indeed, very not a traditional approach at all. Again, I
Yeah.
think in most institutions, the curator is seen kind of up here, the decision maker, the person that ideates alone in a tower
Yeah.
thinking by themselves, right?
Yes.
That it's a very academic thing. And I just don't think there are multiple models of curatorial practice, and this is one of them, right? To tell your thoughts early stages, spaghetti on the wall thoughts, my favorite phrase, but also really to share it in community because it's
Mhm.
not about me. It's
Mhm.
not it's not about just the artist either. It's about how many people we're surrounding. And so, in one way, this is allowing to have multiple perspectives in the exhibition making. So, I had Felicia, who's a curandera. I mentioned this
Yeah.
because, like I said, there's vignettes, and also how Carmen, her pictures depict curanderismo is from a really specific South Texas lens, right? She often says
Got it. Yeah.
faith healer. And so our resident curandera was like, well, it's not always a faith practice. It's not always this, right? This is where I've come from. And so what we're doing is kind of demystifying one kind of one definition for something, right? And this
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
importance to bring the expertise that is not my own, right? We all come with expertise, lived knowledge, learned knowledge, right? And how that kind of contributes to the exhibition is super, super special. Fernando from Testal Kitchen, him and his mom created a recipe that it resonates with some of the cooking scenes that we see within the exhibition. It's really special, right? They're bringing a really specific point of view inspired by some of the works that they're seeing. And then we have someone from a bilingual school, right? We have
Nice.
Children's books were really important for Carmen, especially in the 90s forward. She started creating her own children's books. Importantly, they were
Nice.
bilingual, right? She came of age when she was student teaching, when it wasn't allowed in schools. Like, students were hit for speaking Spanish, right? Students were punished. Students were expelled, right, for walkout. So this is a really tumultuous time when the United States actively tried to wipe out aspects of Mexican American culture. And so when we're now at Herrera Dual Language School, having students read from Carmen's book in English and Spanish, and you'll hear it is something kind of full circle, right? People often forget the histories of this country. For example, why a lot of Mexican Americans, fourth generation forward, don't speak Spanish natively. It's because it was actively pushed out of our communities. And so I think, speaking of Carmen, how radical Carmen's work is, it's incredibly radical. That those children's books are in the same school she was student teaching at that she was fired for speaking Spanish with his students, right? So you have to imagine how. And I think now, in this state, in Arizona, there were books that have been banned, right? For certain things. And so
Absolutely.
it's just a really important history that we don't forget as Mexican Americans, but also as, I think, communities of color that have constantly been marginalized in various aspects of time, of history. And so speaking to how important Carmen's work is, it's for reasons like that, which is really, really special. And the community of practice has done such a great job to help kind of expand upon that.
The only way I can relate to that is my grandfather, and this is going into, that history of America, where my grandfather and grandmother were both in that generation of the last to be taken from their homes and put in boarding schools. And I currently live near Indian School, which is one of the last Arizona boarding schools. And it was, it's turned into a park now. But it is definitely a portion of the history that isn't, I guess, vehemently like yelled, shout out to the top of like, this is what happened, this is wrong. But as a grandson of one of the last persons who's like his school, or when he graduated, he was like the last graduating class from that school. It's tough. It's a tough thing to swallow. It's a tough pill to swallow, and particularly because I'm not fluent in either Spanish nor my native culture language. It is tough to be a statistic and to say like, hey, I understand it. I recognize it, and I want to make a difference. I want to, try and do what I can on my part to make that suffering and that pain subside a little bit by doing whatever I can on my end. But it is particularly hard to kind of, show something because I don't have it all. I don't have, it's hard to help when you don't have the thing that can ultimately make a giant difference, which is knowing your own language, knowing that language. And it unlocks a lot of things too, in particular, those vignette moments where it's like very much a part of a culture, when you have the word that coincides with it. You know, we in particular have all sorts of traditions that I find beautiful and breathtaking and very much relatable into the idea of how life works. But I can't uh translate that, so to speak, because I don't have the language or the kind of the ideas fully fleshed out to give to another person. Now, I try my best and I want to do more, of course, but it takes time and that takes more on my end. So I really do, I find it very beautiful that you in particular with your job, you have this beautiful way of like spending time so that every bit of those details, every bit of that kind of let's help them connect is kind of fleshed out. It is somewhat of like we've had time to process and mitigate these hardships of like the bumps that will stop people from like relating, and we've made it smoother and easier to try traverse that kind of language barrier. So I have a deep appreciation for the curation part. The thing that I now kind of want to look at is the museum as a whole,
Mhm.
the job of the museum, so to speak. And one of the things that is that this is a free space. ASU Art Museum charges zero for admission and offers all programs for free, which is in the museum world is genuinely radical. Now, here in the United States, I think in the European countries, you can go to those museums. I think they ask for donations. They're free, but they ask for donations, so to speak. How does that mission shape the way you think about who you're making the exhibits for? And does it change the risk you're willing to take?
That's a great question. I mean, I think we are guided by the museum's mission, really, that we're
Mhm.
supposed to, we value people over the object, right? That we value,
Yes.
understand that artists and art really underscore the storytelling and community building. And that's
Mhm.
what we're trying to be. We're trying to be a space to do so. And the best way is to remove barriers to entry. Um,
Yes.
of course, removing the barrier to entry of cost is one way to do so, but we still have to bring community into us, right? And so we cannot expect um, for generations and, for how long, museums have been around, we cannot expect community to now feel safe in
Yes.
museum spaces. And so when we think of programming, when I think of exhibitions, um, specifically, we're really guided by our
Mhm.
collection, right? Our collection has over 13,000 objects. We have strength
Yeah.
from art from Latin America and really understanding where we're sited, right? So that really does
Mhm.
dictate a lot of the mission and vision and some of the largest issues that are happening here. Climate, migration, right? We have a show up about migration right now. Um,
Beautiful.
and so this is really important for us, but also so much of our programming is to make sure that we go to community. We can physically move ourselves and
Mhm.
let them know, like we move ourselves outside of the museum because that does have a return rate of people coming to us because they're like,
Yes.
right, these are the folks that came to me in South Phoenix, in
Yeah.
West Phoenix, in Mesa, right, in Deep Tempe, right? There are other places that we can move. And so my colleague in co-creation and learning, Chiro Ochoa, has done a great job of really disseminating her programs. For this particular exhibition, I'm really excited for our opening on May 2nd. My colleague Carla Chavarria has really worked with some large organizations, Poder, All in Education, I think
Nice.
Lucha, other folks to bus people into the museum, right? And so we'll
Oh,
have
wonderful.
folks coming in. And again, these organizations are organizations that we continue to work with, right? We continue to see how the best way to work with them. When I was in ED, I worked with Chispa a lot. So there are these kind of ongoing relationships that we have to make communities say like, hey, I know now I no longer have barriers to entry, but now
Hmm.
I also feel seen, represented, heard. And that's really our big mission here at the museum.
I love that. That's amazing that you guys do that for that community at large because again, you think about the amount of time and effort, especially with the artists and just the amount of time and effort you as the curator and your team. I would love just more people to find ways like it's amazing how we come together when we want to take advantage of something so beautifully put together. And I look at the humanity as a large scope of things. Sometimes I find it so endearing when we take the time to say, "Hey, look, we built something. We want to share that with the community, and we're going to make every effort to grab as many of those community members in different elements as possible, ways like trucking them in, busing them in, whatever it may be." And that to me is really the way that we stay together and commit ourselves to something greater and allow us to grow as a community and grow together. So I will just like kudos to you and your team and kudos to everyone who participates in that. So I'm going to ask you about Arizona as an art scene and
Okay.
just be honest with us. When
Okay.
people think of major arts cities, Phoenix and Tempe don't always come up first. But you choose to be here, and what's happening in Arizona's art scene right now, that the rest, like what is happening right now in Arizona, and the rest of the country is, what do you think the rest of the country sleeping on here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that I think about a lot. Certainly what I think the rest of the countries, if I'm thinking in the art world, the East Coast, what they're looking at and they're trying to understand is the complex nature of migration, of
Hmm.
movement,
Hmm.
and indigeneity and identity, right?
Yeah.
I think all of these questions are something that Arizona grapples with intensely, right?
Hmm.
And I think it's such a wonderfully, as I mentioned earlier, a wonderfully complex place. I lived
Yeah.
many
Yeah.
places. I have never lived in a place like this, right?
Right.
Because we constantly test how we can exist together, right?
It's
Which I think
it's
is, it's so complex. It really
It
is.
it is. It is. It's
And
I mean, we
so
could get into so much, like even just from a modern day perspective. Like we
it
could go yeah.
it is, and it's it's and it's something that I'm very serious about. It's
Mhm.
as we move into the next election cycles, politically, Arizona is probably the place that the nation is going to be watching because it's going to
Oh,
dictate so
yes.
much of the conversations that are having. We are now the fourth largest growing state, right? We used to
Mhm.
be the fifth, now we're the fourth, right?
Mhm.
So there's so much change of people coming into Arizona
Mhm.
already, right? But then so politically, socially, economically,
Economically, yep.
right, all of this is happening, so you have to understand the art scene and like these dynamics of course end up
Mhm.
here. And so what
Yep.
I think a lot of the country is missing, especially when we see kind of large biennials of a temperature check of contemporary art in the United States, they're often missing this really key section here. And so what I find so important, having run a residency program, having nurtured artists
Mhm.
that are from here,
Yeah.
or brought artists to come and kind of challenge the dialogue that's happening here, there's so much happening. And I think there are a lot of young artists that are also creating a lot of these interesting art spaces that are not necessarily institutions, and they're not
Yeah.
necessarily galleries, but they're in between. And that's happening a lot. And it can't happen everywhere because
Yeah.
most of it is not economically feasible, right? And
Yeah.
so there are things that are happening here that cannot exist anywhere else. And that's
Mm.
both special and also really complex, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Um, and so
I'm I want to hang out with you more because we could talk about this for like days and days and
I
days.
think
So
we could.
yeah.
I think it's not talked about enough. So, I always tell my colleagues, like, look at Arizona. Hey, you're doing a big show that you have to do a national survey. Hope you're coming to Arizona, right? Like,
Yeah.
I hope you're coming to
Yeah.
see, not even, necessarily look at artist studios, but like really understand the temperature on the ground that is, right? Like
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
going on here, how climate is really affecting communities, things like that. So
Mhm.
it's a, like I said, a really complex, wonderfully special place in Arizona.
Um, the thing that I want to, or because we're reaching the end of our conversation here, and I want to make sure that I want to end on kind of a really nice note here, because your relationship and how much you've worked on what you're doing now. And after years of deep research into Carmen's life and work, traveling with her stories, sitting with it, and just eating the whole scholarly catalog around it, what did you personally take away that you didn't expect?
Um, I think how, the work was really important to me because I saw, myself reflected. And I think I hear a lot of these stories from people that are like, oh, I don't feel comfortable being in museums, or like,
Yeah.
I don't know anything about art, but like, this reminds me of, my birthday party. This reminds me of, oh, I had a quince and it looked like this, right? So when I was doing the research, what I hadn't expected was how connected I felt. And so I remember the
Mm.
first kind of couple of conversations I had with Carmen. I remember getting kind of emotional because I'm like, oh, she reminds me so much of my grandma, right? Like it reminds me so much,
Yeah.
who's no longer with us. But I was like, oh, or she's so Texan, right? My grandma was
Mhm.
from Texas. My mom was from Texas. It's like, I thought it was really special. And so, um, Carmen's stories, because she's very sharp for 76, she's
That's
has an
amazing.
incredible memory. And so we spent hours just talking, and it was just really, really special. And so it felt, when I was kind of moving forward with the show, I felt this really kind of tremendous responsibility to make sure that how I'm feeling, how I feel about Carmen's work, how
Mhm.
special and intimate it is, and kind of large scale, but it also just some of the stories, I wanted to make sure that that could be passed forward. So
Mhm.
it's something that I learned that I try, I say that every exhibition I'm working with an artist, it's like a relationship, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But this felt a little bit more special in that um, I felt a really big responsibility, right?
Mm. Yeah.
For not only what Carmen has gone through, but people that look like me, people, our next generation of people, right? I
Mhm.
really think this is going to change a lot, right?
Yeah.
Of how many people will be able to feel seen, represented, and not just Mexican Americans, right? But like generally, like to see moments of joy, to hear Carmen's voice in the galleries and
Mhm.
Bloomberg and things like that.
Yeah.
I think is going to be really special. So,
Absolutely.
um, I think what I learned was that I, I can also have something that I think just feels deeply important to do, and this is one of those.
I love that. That's amazing. So this is my final question. The Carmen retrospective runs through September 10th and is heading on a national tour after Tempe. What else is the ASU Art Museum building this summer? What should people know about, and where do you want to take the museum's story from here?
Yes. So this show opens May 2nd. So it's open to the public. Please come by, register at asurmuseum.org. It's open from 6 to 8 that evening. As it closes September 10th, but we'll have other shows coming up. Our next show is called Cross Check with Jacob Truba and William Wegman. It's the first time these works are ever being shown together. It's a collaborative practice, which is the hockey player Jacob Truba, who is playing for the Anaheim Ducks, and his long-term collaboration with William Wegman, who is kind of a well-known conceptual artist.
Yeah.
And so that is really special. We're also really looking forward to, back to your interest in landscape architecture. We're having a show called Landed Legacy with Dennis Numkena and Benny
Yes.
Gonzalez. And so
That's
that is
awesome.
also coming up, a very large retrospective, really, of their two practices, how they're
Beautiful.
related. And so that's really, really special. And then we look on to several other projects. Carmen show, the Carmen Lomas Garza, Picturing the Familiar, it will travel to the Cheech in Riverside,
Oh, the
and it will
Cheech. Nice.
open in October, and then it will travel to El Paso soon after that. And then we're trying to flesh out the rest of the tour, but we're hoping to have a few more venues, which I think is just a very special show. So we're quite busy at the ASU Art Museum. Please follow us. I would love for you to keep apprised with what's going on. We're also launching a subscription model. So please sign up for our newsletter to get all up on the top of our things, and it'll be it's a really fun summer, fall, and time in between, you know.
I love it, because that's essentially, like, I love the fact that you have a nice scope of like work and plethora of work to come your way. But on top of that, you're just, again, moving the dialogue into its next form and just understanding what's coming next. And it's going to be a good time for all of you who are fans of the ASU Art Museum. I applaud you already if you've got your tickets, and I'm excited too, because I think this is something, again, as I've always said, I'm always an avid kind of friend maker. I want to make this podcast become my thing of like building relationships and network. But I think meeting you today was one of my highlights of all time, because it's really great to meet someone who not only like really is part of, like you're saying, you're in trying to make the dialogue happen today. You're part of the art scene, and you're trying to build it and keep it going. So it's really commendable. So, and I have to say, with someone like you at the helm at ASU, I think it's going to go the distance in so many great ways, and have a lot of really important dialogue to have with the community at large. So kudos to you and your team.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great to chat.
Thank you so much. Before we go, do you have any other places where people need to go find you online? If you want to go ahead and give a phone number, an address, the floor is yours. I give it to all of our guests at the end to let themselves promote.
Sure. Well, please follow the museum. So that's on Instagram, on other places, Facebook, things like that, at ASU Art Museum. If you're interested in following me, I'm just my name, Alana__Hernandez on Instagram, and keep up with me. Please come to the opening. My last plug for the opening is La Santa Cecilia will be playing a free concert. It's a huge deal, so I'm really hoping everyone is coming out for this. So please register. I hope to see you there. Testal Kitchen will also be having samples of the recipe that was in the show, so it's just a really special night. So I hope you all can come say hi to me. And I'm looking forward to it, of course.
Well, I really appreciate your time. You have been just really enjoyable to talk to, and just getting to know a little bit more. And before we go, you can hear every episode of Finding Arizona Podcast at our website, findingarizonapodcast.com. Social media-wise, Finding Arizona Podcast under everything. And last but not least, we say kisses, hugs, and belly rubs to our four-legged friends, and we will see you next time. Bye, y'all.